Since 2009, I believe, when I published the first book in the United States through Overlook, I've been in touch with Dean Murphy, who I know is a very significant and active member of the Florida Writers Association. And we've spoken back and forth on numerous occasions about writing and about books, and good books and bad books and the ones in between. And he sort of designated me an honorary member of the Florida Writers Association, hence the t-shirt. And he asked me whether or not I would answer a few questions on the subject of writers and writing in general for the Florida Writers Association. And he sent them to me. I think they've been collated from sort of a general address to the association. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to take up as many as I can. I have a tendency to digress. I have a tendency to go off the subject, but I'm going to try and keep this as straightforward and uncomplicated as we can. It's now 20 to 8 in the evening, Sunday UK time, and by 8 o'clock I hope to shed some light on this strange and ridiculous business that we're involved in. Paul Auster said a very interesting thing. He said that becoming a writer was not a career decision, like becoming a doctor or a policeman. You didn't so much choose it as get chosen, and once you'd reconciled yourself to the fact that you're pretty much useless for anything else, you also had to accept the fact that you were going to walk a long and lonely road for the rest of your life. Being a published author and traveling extensively, I'm often asked, you know, what is it? What is this lifestyle like? And in all honesty, it's sort of 6 months on your own writing novels and then 6 months explaining yourself to strangers. So it's kind of two different worlds, one very insular and internal and individual, and one very much engaged with your readers and engaged with other writers. And, you know, I've always considered that writers and readers are the best people, you know. Readers, you know, before any writer becomes a writer, he's always a great reader. That's where that love of literature comes from voracious reading. And I certainly read voraciously as a teenager and into my 20s. And a great deal of my influences and a great deal of my inspiration as a writer came from other writers. So we can't escape the fact that irrespective of whether or not somebody's a great writer, they are first and foremost a great reader. Anyway, as I said, I digress. We're going to take up these questions and try and answer them as best as possible. It begins, R.J. Ellory is often listed as a crime author, but he doesn't like to be pigeonholed. You call your work human drama. What is that, and how can other novelists achieve similar results? Well, I actually never referred to it as human drama. That was actually a sort of category, a genre that was created by a reviewer, a journalist in a writing magazine in the UK many, many years ago. In France, they call my books slow motion thrillers, which I think is a wonderful expression. A human drama, for me, in essence, is the kind of novel that tells a story, and the telling of the story is paramount. I have a very simplistic perspective on fiction in general. I think essentially there are 3 books. The first category would be your page-turning potboiler, the kind of novel that you pick up at the carousel at the airport before you get on the plane, and it engages your attention for 5 or 6 hours. You complete it, it's interesting, there's an unresolved question posed in the first chapter or the first paragraph, and you spend the rest of the book trying to second guess the author, and then you wind up with the denouement, the unraveling of the knot at the end. And it's satisfying or not, but it's definitely very engaging and definitely very entertaining. However, without in any way, shape or form intending to make this sound critical, it's not the type of book that you read for the scintillating prose, for the lyrical turn of phrase, for the 3.5 page description of the sheer quantity of colours that you find in trees in the fall in Vermont and upstate New York. It's not a book that you read for that kind of prose. It's a book that you read to be entertained, to be engaged. It's often found in the area of police procedurals or thrillers, and it satisfies a particular yearning for that kind of literature. The second type of novel is the kind of novel that's often snobbishly referred to as literary fiction. This is the kind of novel where the author seems to have spent as much time thinking about how they're going to say something just as much as what they're going to say. So the plot in essence sort of becomes secondary. It's a novel that's sometimes criticized as being style over substance, but it's a novel that's written in very lyrical prose. It's a very individual and specific type of style. A classic example of this for me is The Shipping News by Annie Proulx, which is a book I love. she essentially defies all the rules of how to write. I mean, W. Somerset Maugham said there's only 3 rules for writing. Unfortunately, no one will ever agree what they are. And I agree with him. There are no rules about how to do this. And she kind of defies the rules. She misses off the beginnings of sentences. She uses expressions that would not ordinarily be attributed to people and uses them to describe objects. She'll take descriptions and turns of phrase that you ordinarily apply to inanimate objects and apply them to a human being, and yet make you feel as though you know that human being. But it's very definitely falling into the category of literary fiction. And then the third category of novel. This is interesting because I was asked at a literary festival one time how I would define a classic. And a classic, by definition, has to be sort of in defiance of genre, in defiance of subject matter, in defiance of age when it was written. It's also got to take into consideration that it can be written by a novelist of either gender, and that's an irrelevant facet. And I thought about this for some time. What is a classic? What makes a classic? And my definition, the definition for myself, very simply, was the kind of novel that presents you with the narrative so compelling you can't read it fast enough, yet is written so beautifully you can't read it slowly enough. And you get caught in that limbo. You sort of feel transported. You feel as though you're being taken on a journey by the author. It's the sort of book that even as you're reading it, you sort of feel that you have to force yourself to put it down, because if you don't put it down, you're going to finish it. And if you finish it, there won't be any more for you to read tomorrow. It's the sort of novel that once complete, you feel as though you're leaving familiar people behind, friends almost, and you immediately go onto the internet or go to the library to ascertain whether or not the author has written any further books, and you approach the next book by the same author with a degree of trepidation because you don't want them to be one of those authors that wrote one great book and then didn't write anything else of the same sort of caliber. It's the kind of book that you approach to read again 5 years later, and you approach again with a degree of concern that you might be disappointed that maybe you've changed and the book won't be as special anymore. But then you read it and it's just as special, but it's very special for a different reason. And that has to do with your emotional engagement with a particular character, the emotional engagement with a particular situation the central character or subsidiary characters find themselves in, which really brings us to the point of what makes a novel compulsive, what makes a plot compelling. It's often been said that a novel is compelling to the degree that you want to find out what happens next. The thing that makes you turn the page is a desire to know what happens next. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. I think it's the desire to know what happens next to whichever person you identify with. A very well-known author and I had a conversation once after a literary festival upon this very subject, and he was talking about his daughter, who was an avid fan of the works of Patricia Cornwell and had continued to read Patricia Cornwell all the way up to present time, right to her most recent novel. And this author inquired of his daughter what was it about Patricia Cornwell's novels that was so utterly compelling, utterly fascinating, that would literally send her out the house at 9:01 a.m. to the bookstore, to Barnes & Noble, to pick up a hardback copy of the book, whatever it cost, that would cause her to pre-order it on Amazon and ensure that it arrived on the day of its release. What was it that she wanted to know? And after a considerable quantity of questions, it really came down to the fact that there was one subsidiary character that actually traversed all of Patricia Cornwell's novels that this reader identified with. It was a person of similar age, of similar interests, similar sort of situation in life, and she engaged with this character to such a degree that she felt it almost an obligation, a necessity to find out what happened to her next. And that for me really sort of encapsulates the concept of tension in a novel. What makes a novel page turning? Because you care, simply because you care. For me, I only ever really decide upon 3 things when I begin a novel. I have a very vague idea of the kind of subject that I want to write about, whether it be a series of killings in a small town in Georgia during the Depression, a mafia epic spanning 10 cities and 5 decades. It's a very vague idea. The second thing that I'm very certain about is the time and the location, and I think those two go together. You choose a state or you choose a city and you choose a time simultaneously, because Georgia in the 1930s is very different from Georgia in the year 2000. Washington in 1920 is very different from Washington now. And everything about that environment changes as a result of the decade within which you choose to set the novel. The dialect, the politics, the expressions, the food, the culture, the predominant religious views, the predominant philosophy, the ethos of the culture changes literally decade by decade. So write a book set in Washington in 1890, it's going to be a very different book from the book that you set in Washington in 1990. So time and location sort of go together. But the third thing I decide, and this for me is by far the most important thing, is what emotion am I trying to evoke in the reader? For me, the difference between non-fiction and fiction is very easy to identify. Non-fiction has as its primary purpose, from my perspective, a responsibility to the reader to convey information. Its primary purpose is to convey information. So whether or not you want to know about the Bayeux Tapestry or the Doomsday Book or American involvement in the tail end of the Second World War in Southeast Asia and Japan and goodness knows what else, you go to the library, you withdraw a non-fiction work on that subject and you read it in order to glean information. If that book accomplishes any other purpose, i.e. changes a preconception, shifts your viewpoint about some particular subject or some aspect of history, that is a secondary purpose. The primary purpose of non-fiction is to convey information. Now, we've been told for an awful long time that the primary purpose of fiction is to entertain, and I think that's a very limited view. I think the primary purpose of fiction, good fiction especially, is to evoke an emotion in the reader. So when I am formulating a book, when I am working on a book, when I'm thinking about a book before I've literally put the first word on paper, I am thinking about the kind of emotional response that I want to create in the reader. What feeling do I want to give them? Do I want them to feel angered? Do I want them to feel sympathetic? Do I want them to feel nostalgic? Do I want them to feel as though they've experienced a loss? Do I want them to feel as though there's a sense of redemption or vindication? I try and get a very clear idea of the kind of emotion I want to create in the reader. Whether or not the reader actually gets that emotion doesn't matter, because every reader will read the same book from a very different perspective, and they will identify with different aspects of that story from their own personal viewpoints. But at least I am working along the line of maintaining a particular sort of emotional carrier wave, emotional message through that novel. And that keeps me focused, that gives me an opportunity to exclude certain things that detract from that particular emotional effect, to include certain things that contribute to that emotional effect. But the reality of the situation is I don't write an outline, I don't write a synopsis, I don't have any real clue as to how the book will end. What I do know is when and where. I do have some rough idea of the sort of basic structure of the novel and the story I'm trying to tell. But the most important thing for me certainly is the emotion that I'm trying to evoke in the reader. Okay, next question. If you were to advise authors of unpublished novels on an international bestseller strategy, would you suggest they aim for a commercial page-turning potboiler, or literary fiction, or a combination of style and substance? I think the very, very worst book that you can write is the book that you think other people are going to enjoy. I think the very best book that you can write is the book that you believe you yourself would enjoy reading. Pick a genre about which you are enthusiastic. Don't try and write within a formula. There are no formulas. Don't try and write within a popular genre, because by the time you finished your novel, gotten it accepted by an editor, gotten the thing typeset and proofread and editorially changed, and the covers are designed and the promotional campaign worked out, that fad, that genre will no longer be at the forefront of commercial popularity, and you will have a novel that doesn't sell well. Write the novel that you believe that you yourself would like to read. Write a novel that you will enjoy writing. Write within a genre that you feel enthusiastic about, that you are keen on. Don't try and force yourself to write in a genre because it's popular, simply because you think that's going to be commercially successful. If you take a look at Stephen King, if you take a look at John Grisham, if you take a look at Tom Clancy, they essentially created their own genres. King, for an example, who I thoroughly enjoy as a writer, prior to King we had Algernon Blackwood, we had H.P. Lovecraft, we had Washington Irving, we had The Exorcist, we had horror movies of a sort of classic genre, you know, Dracula and Frankenstein and The Mummy and goodness knows what else, the great golden age of American B horror movies. What King did is he basically sort of looked at that and said, I'm going to update all of this, and I'm going to scare the living Jesus out of a blue-collar worker in Pennsylvania by putting a clown in his garage. See, on paper, essentially, as an idea, that doesn't really work. Yet it did, and it works brilliantly. Grisham, you can imagine him trying to pitch a novel to a potential publisher. I'm going to write really racy, exciting, sexy books about legal procedure. Well, you might as well try and write books about root canals, you know. The law is not the most fascinating subject, yet Grisham has done it. These guys wrote the books that they wanted to write. They wrote the books that they believed they themselves would like to read. And their enthusiasm for the subject, their enthusiasm for the material, shines through in their prose. Why are titles important? We've been told publishers will change them anyway, so why bother? At this stage of your career, do publishers actually change your titles? Yes, they do. And I don't have a problem with that, you know. They often look at it from the viewpoint of what's the most potentially commercially appealing title, what's the most commercially appealing brand or cover design. I have no problem. You know, writing the book is an individual procedure, an individual process. Publishing the book is a very, very different beast altogether. It's very much a group activity, a lot of people are involved, and you have to understand and appreciate that a great many people in a great many jobs in all of the publishing houses know a great deal more about how to sell a book than you do. You should stick to writing the book. You should cooperate, coordinate with, work alongside people that you respect, that you admire, that get what you're trying to do, and, you know, figure out between you what's the most successful way in which to promote your books. How do I feel about prologues and epilogues? If they're part of the story, they're part of the story. You know, you hear people say, I don't like prologues. You hear as many people not make any comment about prologues or epilogues at all. If your book requires a prologue to give an insight into some aspect of the backstory, and that's the best way to introduce that story to the reader, then do it. If you need an epilogue, fine, do it. You know, again, getting back to this point, there are no rules and regulations. There is no right way to do this. Aside from On Writing by Stephen King, there's another book I recommend called the Paris Literary Review Anthology Volume 1, published by Picador. And it's basically a collection of 12 or 15 interviews with very, very significant and important writers over the last 100 years. Kurt Vonnegut, Truman Capote, John Steinbeck, Dorothy Parker, people like this. And you only need read 3 or 4 snippets of half a dozen of those interviews to realise that every single author works in an entirely unique way. The way in which they work is as unique as the author. The books that they write are as unique as the author. The books are merely a representation of the author's creativity, and every individual creates in a different way. Whether it takes you 7 weeks or 7 months or 7 years to write a book, it doesn't matter. It's the way you work. Aldous Huxley said, you know, a bad book is as much a labour of love as a good one. You have to devote yourself to it, to commit yourself to it. You have to write when you don't feel like it. You have to get that sense of self-discipline instilled into your routine, that regardless of what's going on, regardless of the distractions, you have to get down and put words on paper. Salman Rushdie said, professional writers are people who finish books. Richard Bach, the author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, said, professional writers are amateurs who didn't quit. A great deal of this is just about doing the work. It is a job of work. It's a job of self-discipline, of persistence, of perseverance, of putting one word after the other. You know, if you want to reach a particular destination, you better start walking. And the walking that you do as a writer, as a painter, as a choreographer, as a musician, is practice. You know, Hemingway said, never let them think that you had to learn the craft. Let them believe that you were born this way. Even Hemingway is acknowledging the fact that you have to do the work. You have to persevere. You have to keep on writing. You know, creative faculties and creative abilities are often defined as muscles. The more you exercise them, the more you use them, the stronger they get. Writer's block. Terry Pratchett, wonderful writer, a genius, said that writer's block was invented by people in California who couldn't write, which was, I don't wish to, you know, in any way, shape or form cast a negative slant on people from California. But the reality of the situation is writer's block is more a sense of physiological inertia, an inability to sit in the chair in front of a typewriter, in front of a computer, and put words on paper. If you feel as though you've got writer's block, do something else. Go take the dogs for a walk. Go out and look at trees for 10 minutes. Sit down and write some really bad poetry. Or just take a favourite book of yours, prop it up next to your computer and start copying it out into a new document. It will help you overcome the physiological inertia of not feeling like writing. I think it was Flaubert who says, when you can't write, just write nonsense. You will get over that physiological barrier. You will get over that sense that you can't do it. And then you throw the first couple of pages away or you rewrite them. You will get into that flow of actually doing the physical motions of working, and you'll start writing. How do you write killer fiction and create the reader's experience in mystery and suspense? In other words, what are some of your most successful techniques for creating suspense? Again, back to characterization, building a realistic character that people can engage with. A story, a novel, is nothing more than creating characters in which people can believe, or in which their disbelief can be suspended, and having those characters do things. That's all a novel is. You tell a story that way. Your characters tell the story for you, with dialogue, with action. You create a believable character. How do you create a believable character? Give them flaws. Make them human. Make them a real person. You don't necessarily have to base them on yourselves or base them on anybody that you know, but you create a character that could exist. And you will give readers an opportunity to feel as though they're spending time with an associate, with a colleague, with a friend, on some kind of adventure. Something is happening. And you'll engage them. That's the simplicity of it. Endings are hard. How do you finish your books before they finish you? Do you outline or define the ending before you start writing, or not? Why or why not? I don't write an outline, but 50% of writers do, 50% of writers don't. There's no right way to do it. Again, we get back to the thing that every writer works in their own unique way. There is no particular formula for doing this. There is no proven successful method of writing a book, apart from sitting down and doing the work. And if you have difficulty with persistence, if you have difficulty with trying again, if you have difficulty with self-belief, if you tend to criticize yourself, invalidate yourself, make less of your own capabilities, then just Google Edison quotes. Look up quotes from Thomas Edison about perseverance, about trying again, about the necessity to get things wrong before you get them right, and very soon you'll find yourself at least to some degree revitalized or reinvigorated on your purpose. That's 20 minutes. So I hope that has covered at least some aspects of things that are going to be of use to you, things that you're going to find of value. If we have literally skimmed the surface, because I think we have, then tell Dean to send me another bunch of questions, or tell Dean to email me and I will make another video and we'll do part 2. But thank you for listening, and I hope it's been of some use to you. Take care.